Thank you, Mr. Toastmaster. How do you start a dulcet speech? How do you make an impact when you begin your speech? I'm not going to talk about the beginning of the speech. I just wanted to make an impact. But after I'm done today, I expect all of you to be quite scholarly about concluding your speech. Let's talk about what you should be thinking about when you're thinking about the conclusion for your speech. How do you wrap up your speech? How do you make sure that your audience knows that you're actually done with your speech? You don't want to be hanging out at the end of your speech and your audience is wondering what you're going to say next. So you want to come complete circle and finish your speech. Maybe you want to be scholarly at the end or have a secret and put a mask on. Have an impact. How do you impact your audience? What you'd like your audience to do is have a takeaway and that they remember what you were speaking about. If you're doing a 6-minute speech, spend 18 to 36 seconds concluding your speech. Let's talk about some closing techniques. How do you want to close your speech? If you use a quotation, you could become an authority, even though you're using somebody else's quote and somebody else's name. It could be funny, it could be amusing. And when your audience laughs at the end, that may give the impact that you need and they may remember what you were speaking about. And it could be something to really drive home the point of your speech, to really drive home that impact and leave your speakers with something to take home. Sometimes you might want to just tell a short story or an anecdote to summarize and kind of wrap up your speech and go full circle. What you've been talking about maybe applies to your life, so you tell a short story in your life. This should be something that you put together and make it short and dulcet. And it could be something to really, again, drive home the point of your speech. Sometimes when you're done and when you want to conclude your speech, you really want people to go off and do something. You think you made this impact, but unless they go and actually take some kind of action, perhaps the speech hasn't really sunk in. So if you're going to call for an action, make sure it's very explicit on what you want the audience to do. And I think we heard that from Asta. If you find a big cow turd, be sure and roll it over because there's going to be something green underneath it. You may want to conclude your speech with a rhetorical question. Can we really afford to conclude our speech? Can we really afford not to conclude our speech? Of course, we have to conclude it, and we'd like to make it so that it's impactful for others. I talked about coming full circle. You may start out your speech with a quote. You could end your speech with the same quote or a portion of that quote, or you could even do a different quote at the end of your speech. You may want to start your speech with a quote and sort of interweave some of that part of your quote into your speech and then conclude with that quote. But if you come full circle and talk about what you started with and conclude, then that'll come full circle. Your audience will know that you're done with your speech and they'll know what you were speaking about, and hopefully they'll remember the last words of your speech and have something to take away. When you begin your speech, You may do a surprise opening by putting on a mask and a hat. And you may talk about what you did. You may talk at the beginning of your speech, you may say, I'm going to talk about this, and here's the 3 points I'm going to make. And so at the end of your speech, you could summarize those main points. You've introduced your speech, you've talked about those main points, and then at the end of your speech, you could say, here's what I talked about, and here's a summary of item 1, here's a summary of item 2, here's a summary of item 3. And I want to mention, when you conclude your speech, don't thank the audience. The audience should be thanking you for the information and for the speech and the time and effort you took to deliver that speech. So when you conclude your speech, simply say, Mr. Toastmaster or Madam Toastmaster when you're done with your speech. Be sure you know how you're going to conclude your speech. If you're in an audience, if you're live in front of an audience, you don't want to be looking at your notes when you're delivering your conclusion. Be sure you're aware of the time. And be sure that you conclude with what you plan to conclude with. Don't try to throw some things in at the end, because that will just be a little bit confusing. I'm going to go ahead and read you this quote. And by the way, you can only use this quote when you're giving a speech on how to conclude a speech. Great is the art of beginning, but greater is the art of ending. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Mr. Toastmaster.